Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of Overcoming Depression and Anxiety, brought to you by Healthy Me Summits. I'm Joanna Rushton, your host, and we are being joined here today by Jeffrey Smith. Jeffrey is an international best-selling author, award-winning filmmaker, executive director of the Institute of Responsible Technology, and a leading spokesperson on the health dangers of GMOs. Jeffrey, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Jeffrey, we are going to really dive in and explore the dangers of GMO today that is filtrating through, well, very largely through our food industry and through our crops, but also looking at some other areas that GMO has started to filtrate through as well. And I think first and foremostly for our viewers, I would love to know, as a filmmaker, what got you involved in GMOs in the first place, and in really looking at the research in that area?
Actually, GMOs got me into being a filmmaker. GMOs got me into being an author. GMOs got me into being a speaker and a traveler and a testifier and all that. So the first thing, I was a perennial or a chronic do-gooder, and just helping out where I could and working for nonprofits. And I also was consulting with companies in communications and strategy and education. And I learned about GMOs in 1996 and learned how dangerous they were and how serious the footprint of devastation they could have in affecting everyone who eats and all living beings and all future generations, because of the fact that they were genetically engineering the food supply and releasing it outdoors where it could cross-pollinate and contaminate the gene pool essentially forever. So I realized these guys that know the dangers need to be able to communicate it, need to have a strategy. So I jumped on board. And I've written 2 books and made 3 movies. I'm working on my 4th movie. And I just did a survey, but I'm going to preview it in just a moment, and to tell you that 49.4% of the people who responded to the survey saying that they got better from health conditions after removing GMOs from their diet reported that the improved symptom that they got better from was anxiety and depression. So basically half the people who noticed an improvement when they switched their diet included anxiety or depression as the result. And we'll talk about that and why and all that stuff. But I wanted to make sure that those people who are particularly interested in that don't feel like we're going to be stepping off topic, because actually it could be very on topic for many people.
Yeah, that is fantastic. You know, I guess first of all, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to exactly what a GMO is, a genetically modified organism. And if you can just explain to us a little bit about exactly how that happens, because we talk about cross-pollination and genes coming from one organism into another. And I really just want the viewers to understand, A, how unnatural that is, and what we're having to manipulate in Mother Nature for this sort of thing to happen.
Well, imagine that you put a pig and a tomato in a room, turned down the lights, played some music, served some wine. You're not going to end up with any action going there. You're not going to end up with little piglet tomatoes. But you can take a gene from the pig and make millions of copies, put it into a gun, shoot the gun into a plate of millions of tomato cells, hoping that some of the genes make it into the DNA of the tomato cells, and then clone those cells into tomato plants, and now you have a combination that could never have occurred in nature, no matter how hard you tried. So that process of inserting the gene through a gene gun or through bacterial infection and then cloning the cell causes massive collateral damage. So you're not just having a tomato with one single change, being a particular gene from the pig. You actually have 2 to 4% of the genome of the DNA of the tomato altered because of mutations. Genes can be deleted, switched on, switched off. Up to 5% of the existing genes in the tomato or any organism might be changed in their levels of expression when the single gene is from a foreign species is there. So it really can create an enormous amount of collateral damage. And this is what the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration scientists warned about in the early 1990s when they were asked to comment on GMOs and to help contribute to a policy for their regulation. And they said allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems could come out as a result of the very process itself. However, the White House had their eye on an export market. They wanted to gain control of their dwindling trade deficit. And so they felt like if they could genetically engineer and patent the food supply with American businesses, it would increase U.S. trade and domination of U.S. Food trade around the world. So they told the FDA promote GMOs, and so the FDA recruited Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney. Monsanto's the big GMO company, and he became in charge of FDA policy, and he ignored the scientists and said, we don't see any significant difference between GMOs and non-GMOs. Put them on the market. Monsanto, who told us that Agent Orange, PCBs, and DDT were safe, can put it on the market on their own without even telling the FDA or consumers. And then Michael Taylor became Monsanto's vice president, and conveniently he's back at the FDA as the US food czar. Now, years later, we became aware of the memos that were circulating in the FDA because of a lawsuit, that the scientists were up in arms about this. They were against this policy. They said, no, GMOs are dangerous. We need to do long-term toxicological studies, human studies, etc. So very few studies are actually done. And those that are done have now been showing significant impacts on animals. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine a number of years ago reviewed just the animal feeding studies in peer-reviewed journals and found physiological changes like gastrointestinal problems, immune problems, reproductive problems, problems of regulating cholesterol and insulin, accelerated aging, organ damage. And they said every doctor should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient. So I started interviewing physicians who were prescribing non-GMO diets back in 2009 and was stunned to find that they were reporting dramatic health improvements when people took their advice and eliminated GMOs. So now we actually have overwhelming anecdotal or case study evidence of real, people really experiencing non-GMO and seeing the changes. And now we have a lot more scientific evidence, which will explain linking GMOs specifically to a long list of diseases, including anxiety and depression.
Wow. So just to get a little bit of an understanding for those, in the camp of being pro GMOs, they would have had an understanding that one of the reasons why they were creating this method was to increase crop return and to, possibly improve the environment or the resistance of a crop and improve the food source itself. That's a lot of what I read in the pro camp for GMOs. So is that what they...
You could have been reading that for 20 years, for 30 years before they even introduced it. It turns out GMOs don't increase yield. They actually, on average, reduce yield. This is according to the United States Department of Agriculture research, according to independent studies. There's a Union of Concerned Scientists report called Failure to Yield. It's well known by experts that GMOs don't increase yield. It's well lied by pro-GMO advocates that it does, and they don't have the data to support it. Thousands of independent field trials have shown that either there's no change or there's a reduction. It was not designed to feed the world. If it were designed to feed the world, they would have put together a completely different package of products. You see, Monsanto's number one selling product was Roundup, and that's an herbicide, and it was going off of patent in 2000. And so they were desperate and created Roundup-ready crops that were engineered not to die when you sprayed Roundup herbicide. And farmers had to sign that they had to use Monsanto's version or their licensed version of Roundup. And the active ingredient is called glyphosate. We'll get into that because that relates to a lot of what we're talking about. And so they created the products in order to create a de facto extension of their patent, a kind of a guarantee that a lot of the farmers would use their version and not the generic version. And it worked. In fact, the use of Roundup has skyrocketed to unprecedented levels. It's now in air and water samples and rain samples, and it's in breast milk here, it's in urine, it's in blood of unborn babies. It's ubiquitous, hundreds of millions of pounds. And unfortunately, the biotech industry, Monsanto in particular, has been lying about the safety of their products, and Monsanto has been specifically covering up information about glyphosate and Roundup, glyphosate the active ingredient, and Roundup, all these extra chemical soups put together with the glyphosate. And what we know now is kind of devastating, that we're actually facing a very significant health impact as a result of GMOs.
And so, am I right in thinking that there's two categories of GMOs or GMO foods that we have to be aware of? One of the herbicides and one of the pesticide-producing crops?
Right. So 80% of GMOs are engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup. And then there's about 20% that are engineered to produce their own toxic insecticide called Bt toxin, named after a soil bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, because it produces its own natural killer of insects. And the way it kills insects is it breaks open little holes in the walls of their stomachs, of their guts, and then that kills them. It kills them in many ways. There's bacterial infection, etc. So they put the Bt toxin producing gene from the bacteria into corn and cotton. So we eat that and we end up with this hole punching toxin that's also an allergen. So we may have allergic reactions, we may have holes in our guts. Now, the US food safety regulators, the Australian food safety regulators, they all come up with a smokescreen saying that, well, Bt doesn't have any impact on humans or mammals. And they say that because they ignore peer-reviewed published studies. They ignore the fact that mice exposed to just the natural Bt in the soil end up with immune system reactions and damaged intestines. Humans, farm workers exposed to that same spray, not the GMOs, the spray, end up with immune system reactions. So much so that the experts in the United States that advise the Environmental Protection Agency warned them and said, there's evidence that this is the case, you need to check it out. They and others didn't check it out, and they just waved Bt toxin creating products onto the market, even though the toxin that's produced in the crop is thousands of times more concentrated than the spray. It can't be washed off. It doesn't biodegrade like it does in the spray form. It's even designed to be more toxic than the natural version. And a study in 2012 in the Journal of Applied Toxicology showed that, in fact, it does poke holes in human cells. So we're in a situation where it can get into our bodies, it can get into our blood. In Canada, they found the Bt toxin in 93% of the pregnant women tested. If it gets into the blood, it might cause damage to the red blood cells, as it does in mice. And it can get into the unborn fetuses, into their bloodstream. It was found in 80% of the unborn fetuses in the same study. And it might get into the brain because the blood-brain barrier is not well developed. So now you have a hole-poking toxin in the brain of the offspring of this generation, on top of the fact that it might be creating allergic reactions. So it's a real crime. It could be related to a whole host of conditions, including anxiety and depression, which is related to gut. And there's a lot of reasons why the whole gut situation might be a problem when you put holes up and down the walls of the intestines, as you might imagine.
So, I really want to get into understanding exactly what it is in these chemicals that are creating the destruction of our gut, which we know has a direct relationship back into the blood-brain barrier. Before we do, can we just run through the food chain that are most infiltrated right now with GMOs for our audience to really become aware of what they could be buying that potentially could actually be a GMO?
There are nine genetically modified food crops. Soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa are the 6 major ones. So in case that was too fast, soy is derived into soy lecithin, soy protein isolate, tofu, etc., soybean oil. Corn has zillions of derivatives with hard to pronounce names. You can go to non-GMOshoppingguide.com for a list, non-GMOshoppingguide.com. Cotton is a food, cottonseed oil. Canola oil, you're familiar with canola in Australia. I was sent by local advocates to meet with ministers of agriculture in every state that was considering lifting the moratorium on canola, and we were unsuccessful. We warned them that the problems would happen, and exactly what we warned came true in Australia, but it's in the food supply. Alfalfa, which is used as hay for animals, sugar from sugar beets, and then I don't know if you have it there, but we have some zucchini, yellow squash, and papaya from Hawaii or China. Those are the GM crops. There's a potato and a apple that are anticipated to be introduced to the market next year, but right now they're not on the market.
Okay. So let's get in and start really educating our audience on what it is within the GMO process and the chemicals used that start to really alter our internal environment, that starts to create the many immune and autoimmune diseases, and link those back to what we're here for, which is really to understand the many contributing factors towards depression and anxiety.
I've got a few, and it'll be fun to enlighten the audience because people don't really think much about food in relationship to anxiety, depression, autism, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, etc. But we have a lot of evidence. So let's just finish up with Bt toxin because we'll spend a little more time on the Roundup and the glyphosate. If Bt toxin pokes holes in human cells, it might create what's called leaky gut. And you've probably covered leaky gut in other talks. I'll just give my autoimmune disease analogy. If you have holes in the walls of the intestines, then undigested proteins can jump through before they're fully broken down into the bloodstream. And then when the molecules or the components of the immune system start to attack that, they all take out their iPhones. And so they take out their iPhones and they take pictures of the intruder and put it on Facebook. And so all of the other immune system organisms look on Facebook and it says, attack anything that looks like this. The problem is the immune system uses an old version of the iPhone, very pixelated, very fuzzy. And so when the immune system looks at the picture, they attack anything that looks like it, which could be the thyroid, the microvilli of the intestines, the pancreas, and there you have autoimmune disease. Because because of the holes in the walls of the intestines and because of old iPhones. That's the reason why we have autoimmune disease, because of the what's called molecular mimicry, where the immune system starts attacking the self. Now, the Bt toxin could easily explain that by creating holes in the walls of the intestines. The study that was done showed that it needed a lot of Bt toxin in a test tube in order to create that, maybe more than is normally reported to be produced by corn. But you see, the amount that's produced by corn turns out to vary considerably because it's not stable based on other studies. And also, the only human feeding study ever done on GMOs found that the genes inserted into soybeans, which are Roundup ready, so they're a different type, the gene transferred into the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines. Now, if it continues to function, it means it might be producing these genetically modified proteins over and over again, 24/7, inside of us. If that happened with Bt toxin, it might convert our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories, producing Bt toxin 24/7. Now, this might explain why 93% of the pregnant women tested in Canada had Bt toxin in their blood. The scientists were perplexed because the Bt toxin should wash out of the blood very quickly. And that means they must be eating it very regularly, but it's not Mexico where they eat corn tortillas every day. Most of the corn products in Canada are refined. There's no more Bt toxin in corn oil and high fructose corn syrup and in maltodextrin. So they figured maybe the Bt toxin came from milk and meat of animals that do eat Bt corn every day. And when they're slaughtered or use their milk, then the Bt toxin would survive. A more plausible explanation, or another plausible explanation, might be that the Bt toxin was being produced continuously inside the guts of these people in North America. So that's very worrisome. And the leaky gut is linked to cancer, heart disease, it's linked to autoimmune disease, inflammation, allergies, autism, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and a number of other things. Basically, also inflammation, and inflammation is in turn linked to so many things. Now, when we switch over to Roundup, and for Roundup ready crops, the Roundup is soaked into the crops. You can't wash it off. You can't just put it under the sink and expect it to go away. It is absorbed. In fact, there are other chemicals in Roundup besides the glyphosate that help push the glyphosate into the crops, and then you have with residues in the soybean oil and the canola oil, etc. Now, the glyphosate residues, it turns out, have problems that also can create leaky gut. You see, glyphosate is patented, one of its patents is as an antibiotic. It kills bacteria. Now, the gut bacteria is very important for us. 2 to 6 pounds of us It's by contrast, the heart is only 0.7 pounds. The the brain is like 2.6 pounds. So you have a situation where there's huge amounts of gut bacteria. 9 out of 10 cells in our body are bacterial cells. They're smaller than ours, but they outnumber us 10 to 1. And they're part of our immune system, and they're part of our production system for vitamins and amino acids, and they're part of our detox system, and they help protect the lining of the gut from permeable gut. If there's an overgrowth of negative gut bacteria, that can produce zonulin, and zonulin can cause a gap between the cell walls and the intestines. And that's the traditional form of leaky gut, not holes in the cells, but holes between the cells. Now, that's if there's an overgrowth of negative gut bacteria. It turns out that glyphosate is a selective assassin as an antibiotic. It kills the beneficial bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria and other things, but not Salmonella, botulism, E. coli, Clostridium, and those can overgrow. So the pathogenic ones can overgrow. And that means it provides the basis for the more traditional leaky gut, or the holes between the cells in the intestines. So that by itself can explain that, but there's other things. Glyphosate is also originally patented as a descaler or cleaner for industrial boilers and pipes. And the way it works is it's a chelator. It's a molecule that attaches to minerals very, very tightly. And so when you wash these industrial boilers, it would grab the minerals off of the caked, deposits for cleaning. It grabs so many of our minerals, from calcium to magnesium to manganese to cobalt to selenium. All these are bound tightly by glyphosate. And when it binds with glyphosate, they become unavailable to use. And that's how it kills plants. It makes the plants unable to use minerals. And minerals are like the lock and the key to complex metabolic pathways. You need manganese, you need cobalt for things like the shikimate pathway. You need them, and if you don't have them, that entire function in the body or the plant does not occur. And so the way it kills is, it's very interesting, it creates a weak and sick plant because it's unable to defend itself against disease. It doesn't kill the plant directly, it just makes it depleted of minerals. And then it promotes the pathogens in the soil because it promotes fungal-based pathogens, it helps them grow, and those pathogens kill the plant. So it creates an imbalance in the soil as well as an imbalance in our gut. Now, Monsanto bragged for years that their Roundup only blocked the shikimate pathway, and that's why it killed plants, and that's why it was safe for humans, because we don't have a shikimate pathway. Well, there's a class action lawsuit against Monsanto in the United States because they neglected to tell us that the bacteria in our gut use the shikimate pathway to produce the amino acids, the aromatic amino acids, which are the building blocks of serotonin and dopamine. And serotonin, in turn, is a precursor to melatonin. So you end up with an inability, if you have blocked the shikimate pathway, to produce this very important set of neurotransmitters. And that may be a key reason why GMOs and Roundup are linked to depression. Because 90% of the serotonin is produced in the gut, I'm told. And if that is blocked by blocking the shikimate pathway, we're in a lot of trouble. And between those three neurotransmitters, they also work on sleep cycle. They help prevent Parkinson's disease, they regulate blood sugar, and they also tell the body I'm full and can stop eating, so it's linked to obesity. So I've been interviewing people from the stage in my lectures, over 125 lectures, saying, okay, how many people have gotten better from something when they switch to non-GMO and organic? And the number one problem in every lecture, when I ask, okay, how many others have noticed this problem, is gastrointestinal. By far, it is the number one improved condition with a non-GMO or organic diet. And I'm going to read you that we did a survey with 200,000 people, and 3,600 of them responded. And we asked them, of those who are getting better from a GMO diet or non-GMO diet, where are you getting better from? And digestion was the number one. 82.7% of everyone, or actually it's, 82.7% of everyone who got better from something got better from gastrointestinal problems. The second most popular category that I noticed in every lecture, and I combined two different symptoms to make it easy, was increased energy and reduced brain fog. And in the survey, we have 56% of people, the number two, saying that fatigue and low energy was the second most popular category that got better. So it matched exactly my experience over 3 years of asking these groups. And then clouding of consciousness or brain fog was 49.8%, following closely thereafter. Now, after these two, gastrointestinal and fatigue and brain fog, which can be explained by mitochondrial dysfunction, which we can talk about if you'd like, then there was a group that was about even. Sometimes it'd be more in one group, sometimes more in another. That would be weight problems, like obesity or overweight problems, then food allergies or immune system problems of all types, skin conditions, and mental conditions. Mental conditions would be primarily anxiety and depression. And in this report that we did, the survey, it turns out, just as we experienced in these rooms asking people, overweight or obesity was 53%, food allergies or sensitivities was 49.6%, anxiety, depression was 49.4%, memory and concentration, again another mental issue, was 46.4%, and then there was also joint pain, other types of pain, fibromyalgia, that was about 46%, seasonal allergies about 45%. And then we have other things which are lower levels, gluten sensitivity and insomnia and hormonal problems and autism and things like that. So we have a situation where we've been backing up the evidence more and more with additional, not only additional testimonials and additional data, but also by looking at the epidemiological studies and seeing if people are in the United States, for example, are having higher levels or higher incidences of these diseases or disorders when GMOs were introduced or since GMOs were introduced. And it turns out that it's remarkable. The two lines in the graph follow as if they're parallel for all sorts of disorders. The rise of autism, the rise of diabetes, the rise of variety of diseases and disorders following the rise in the use of GMOs and the rise in the use of Roundup. And just to finish this data, just to share with you as a further breakdown, within the anxiety and depression, I mentioned there was just about 50% of the people that reported did improve in anxiety or depression. The mild improvement out of 5, from between mild improvement and complete recovery, was only 5%. The moderate improvement was about 9%. Significant improvement was the highest level at about 18.5%. Nearly gone was 9%, and complete recovery was 8%. So there was only like 14% of the people that reported an improvement that were either mild or some or moderate. So most everyone was significant, nearly gone, or complete recovery. Now I want to explain how to interpret this data. It doesn't mean that half of the people who have anxiety or depression will get better. It means of the people who get better when they switch their diet, half of them reported improvements in anxiety or depression. And here's the logic. We've had people say that when their kids switch to organic food, they're no longer autistic. We have before and after diagnoses. We have doctors saying the same thing. When I interviewed a doctor about it, she said, yes, a certain percentage of autistic children will recover completely or significantly just by diet. But there are many that won't. And that's what we find in terms of this whole list of diseases and disorders, that a certain percentage of people will get better completely or significantly by changing their diet, and some won't. So we don't know who they are, and we don't know how to evaluate. You may be in a better position to do that. But what I recommend is that for people who hear this, to try it and to do a medical or and a mood journal and over the time. And it's best to switch to 100% organic and not just non-GMO, and here's why. Roundup is not just sprayed on Roundup Ready crops. It's sprayed just before harvest as a ripening agent. It dries down and kills the plant and makes weeding easier for the next season. So it's sprayed on wheat, barley, rice, rye, basically the cereals. It's sprayed on the pulses, lentils, and other beans and peas, dried peas. It's sprayed on potatoes and sweet potatoes, and it's sprayed in vineyards. It turns out in the United States, they actually had to increase the allowable residues of glyphosate on food crops because of this practice, raised it to 1 million times higher than the level which was associated with multiplying human breast cancer cells. So they did it for economic reasons, not based on science. The current acceptable daily intake of Roundup and glyphosate is completely skewed in the direction of industrial interests and not based in science. They ignore the hormonal endocrine disruption levels. So we can't really accept any level of glyphosate, even though it's there in our bodies. And so I strongly recommend that people switch to 100% organic, especially if they're suffering from one of these chronic diseases, switch their whole family. And one other story before I turn it over to you. I'm dominating here a bit. I talked to doctors who treat an autistic child or a child, a pediatrician. And she says, okay, change the diet. So the whole family changes their diet because it's easier to not have the bad foods in the house. Everyone changes the diet. Everyone eats together. Now, the autistic child or whoever they're treating may have a lot of different things. They may have supplements, they may have medicines, but the rest of the family, all they did was change their diet. And they're telling the doctor, oh, my eczema went away, my anxiety went away, I'm sleeping better, we started to lose weight. So they weren't even planning to get better. They were just planning to change in order to accommodate the prescription of a new diet for the child, and yet everyone gets better. And we hear that all the time, all the time.
Wow. This is amazing information, and it's so valuable to our audience. And one of the things that you brought up there was, a question that I had around, is there a safe level of consumption of this residue? Because I know from what I've read here in Australia that unless a product has got more than 1% of a genetically modified agent in it, then it doesn't have to be labeled genetically modified. But what I'm hearing you say here is that there is no safe level. So that 1%, by which if it's under 1% or 1% or under, we don't have to have that product labeled. But what I'm hearing you say is that even at that 1%, we're exposing ourselves to absolutely detrimental levels that could lead to health risks.
Well, let me be clear, because there's percentage of Roundup residues or glyphosate residues, and there's percentage of GMOs in the product. We were talking about percentage of glyphosate residues. Okay, so and that means like if the amount that's allowed on wheat is a lot higher than you'd want to put in your body if you knew the research. The amount of GMOs that are allowed for labeling, it's an interesting thing in Australia. You don't require labeling of products that you can't find the DNA in after processing. So like you don't require any labels on soybean oil, I don't believe. Even though soybean oil has high levels of glyphosate residues. Very, very high levels, extremely high levels. And same would be with canola or cottonseed oil or corn oil. And they're not labeled. There's no requirement for labeling because they have the mistaken impression, well, there's no risk because there's no GMO genes or proteins produced or available in the final product. So you have this huge gaping loophole. The other loophole you have, which is available in all the 64 countries that require labeling, the other loophole that they all have is they don't require labeling of milk and meat products from animals that have been fed GMO. And we know that the animals, there was a scientist who lives in New Zealand who did a paper showing that the animals that are fed GMOs are physiologically different. And if you put together all the differences, they have earlier death, organ damage, they have problems with fertility, gastrointestinal issues, immune system problems. It's a whole array of things that we see in the peer-reviewed literature. And then there's the percentage. Now, practically speaking, you can't do a 0% verification effectively. It wouldn't fly. No one would try for it because it's, you throw a single grain of corn onto a huge ship of non-GM corn and you've just contaminated it. You've got to have some level of tolerance for practical purposes. But the body doesn't necessarily go by that logic. I don't have any idea what percentage would be considered safe in terms of GMOs, but I'll give you a few examples of things that may raise the level of concern. There was a corn variety called Starlink. I used to work in a GMO detection laboratory as the VP of marketing, and my lab director called me and said, we just found Starlink in taco shells that were submitted by these activist groups. I said, don't tell the client yet, retest it first to be absolutely sure. It was an illegal variety for human consumption because it was likely an allergen. And when it was confirmed and we put it out there, it cost about $1 billion. 315 different products in the US market were subject to recall, and the rest of the world closed its doors to US corn for a while. So it was a big deal. But there was a lot of economic pressure to allow low levels of Starlink in the corn supply. It had only been used in 1% or less of the US corn supply. And there was strong pressure on the US experts to allow larger amounts. And they said, no, there's no level which we can consider safe because allergens can operate at tiny amounts. Then there was a food supplement called L-tryptophan, which is an amino acid. It was produced by a Japanese company in the 1980s, and it was produced by genetically engineered bacteria. And the process of genetic engineering almost certainly created contaminants that caused thousands and thousands, 5,000 to 10,000 people to fall sick and some became permanently disabled. It killed about 100 people. And the percentage of the tryptophan pills that were contaminated was less than 1.5% because it passed the pharmacological standard for purity at 98.5%. The Roundup, glyphosate Roundup was fed to rats over 2 years by a group of scientists in France, Seralini and others, and they found that when they used a tiny amount of Roundup for the rats, they still ended up with the same symptoms that they saw in the other rats, which was multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage, particularly the liver and kidneys, and also pituitary. The amount of Roundup or glyphosate equivalent was 50 parts per trillion, which is 14,000 times less than the amount allowed in the water supply in the United States. So we're talking, and there's also multiplication of human breast cancer cells in parts per quadrillion. So what this means is that glyphosate acts as an endocrine disruptor. And it's interesting about endocrine disruption. It means that at very, very tiny levels, it'll affect certain systems more than if you increase the dose. For certain poisons, the dose makes the poison. For endocrine disruption, the smaller amount actually creates the disruption. So if you look at a graph of the effect, it looks like a U. It's very high at one end when there's a high amount of the chemical, and it's very high at the other end when there's a low amount of the chemical, and it's at the bottom in between. And documents that were sealed by the EPA in the United States, that were Monsanto's own documents, show that they knew of this low dose powerhouse that they had with glyphosate. They ignored it, and none of the regulators around the world require testing for these low dose effects. So I don't know if there's a way that in North America could prevent exposure to tiny levels. So I'm fine. I'll just do my best. I'm not going to get depressed about it.
And I think that's a really important message right there, because there is only so much we can be in control of. As you say, Roundup is used on non-GMO foods, and even when they are used, the spray travels, and the spray can travel to, areas where foods are actually grown organically. And so we do what we can, and I think that is that is a worry, that the spray can go viral, so to speak, through the air and travel into our waterways, into various other systems that we know, and we can be taking it in and be exposed to it, not even through the food that we eat, but through all the multiple other avenues that you've spoken about. So rather than worry, we can only do what we can to control our own environment. And
also, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, that's very much affects my work as a communicator and an activist, because I get in front of audiences, well over 100,000 in the last few years, live audiences, and millions online and in TV and radio. And I'm giving pretty heavy duty information, and I'm drenched in it myself. I talk about it every day. I write about it. If you see the movie Genetic Roulette, it's like, whoa, people just open their eyes and go, I can't believe that. And now I'm doing a movie called Secret Ingredients. You can see the trailer at secretingredientsmovie.com, where it's about families that heal from chronic conditions by eliminating GMOs and pesticides from their diet. And we have the people reporting breast cancer and diabetes and autism like that live in front of you, and the doctor saying, yes, I see that in my patients, and the scientist saying, here's why. So I didn't cover a lot of the problems with GMOs or glyphosate. I didn't cover the mitochondrial problem, the birth defect problem, the problem with creating vitamin D, and everything from cataracts to the ability to the liver to detox. There's a lot of stuff there, okay? But I give a talk, and if I just finished the talk and said, that's it, goodbye everyone, see you later, it would be like spreading, in fact, if I say, I'm about to give you the details of GMOs, and I call this section of my talk, Death, Disease, Destruction, and Despair. And I said, but don't leave in the middle, because you'll be really depressed. Stay around for the end. So I have to give, especially because this is a summit on depression, I have to give you the end. I have to give you the ability to take this information and digest it properly, so that you end up feeling like a victim, not a victor. I mean, not a victor, like a victim, so that you can convert it. You can chew it up and digest it and convert it to energy and power. So there's energy in, sometimes I'll say to the group, how many people feel sad? How many people feel angry? How many people feel fearful? And hands go up. And I said, okay, you can choose how you want to react to this information as you want, but I want to make a recommendation that you take that energy that's in the emotion and you convert it to action and empowerment, so that you decide what you consider to be food and what you consider to be what I call an FSO, a food-shaped object. You decide what you'll put in your mouth and not have it dictated to you by Monsanto or its enforcement wing, the FDA. And we can do this together, and it's up to us to make that decision. And there's a couple other things I say. I say, if you happen to accidentally eat a GMO, don't worry about it, because worrying is toxic, and GMOs are toxic. Now you have two of them, so just forget about it. But the other thing I say is, what we actually have here in the world of GMOs is more leverage with our dollars than almost any other major health problem on the planet. I'm talking major health problem. There are no consumer benefits to GMOs. If they turn out to be a marketing liability, if food companies start to lose money because a certain small percentage of shoppers are eliminating that product from their shopping list, the company can eliminate the GMO ingredient without sacrificing flavor or texture or mouthfeel, all that. They can simply get the non-GMO canola, which is the canola that's mostly grown in Australia. They can get the non-GMO corn, and they can protect their market share. That's how GMOs were kicked out of Europe. Not because of a mandate by the European Commission. They're still legal to buy and eat GMOs there. They have to be labeled, but you can still buy them. But no one uses them, because on April 27th, April 27th, 1999, Unilever said no more GMOs in European brands. Then Nestle said it on April 28th, and everyone else said it a week later. A tipping point occurred when there was enough awareness. We had a tipping point in the United States against genetically engineered bovine growth hormone, a drug that increases the cancer-related hormone in the milk from cows, kicked out of most American dairies, a tipping point. We tipped GMOs out of the natural products industry in 2013, and now we are poised to kick GMOs out of the conventional industry. How do we do it? through education. We don't need to educate everyone. It's not a vote. We need just a small percentage of the population to demonstrate to the food companies that it's a marketing liability. Back in the early days when people were just becoming aware of GMOs, there was two types of soy milk in Australia, So Good and So Natural, and something like that. And one of them started becoming non-GMO, and their shares increased dramatically. Even though they were number two, they were growing dramatically because everyone became aware of it and started to spend some more money there. And that economic power is simply by telling people, you don't have to do a boycott that's altruistic. You just protect yourself, protect your kids, and tell your family about it, and they start protecting themselves, and the market changes. So some of the biggest companies in the world are already having plans to remove GMOs in the United States and haven't told anyone. I know about some of them. And I think we're going to hit a tipping point very soon here. And the more people in Australia, of course, will create a tipping point there too. And it's a matter of education. And the education is the kind that we're doing today, where it's not necessarily about lower yields or patent infringement and the plight of farmers, all of which are important. But what will drive people's decision at the supermarket is the health consideration. And the group that'll be driven the most are mothers.
I was just about to say that exact same thing right there. And, you know, I work with a lot of mums, and I work with a lot of families. And, you know, the organizer of the home and the runner of the home, so to speak, 9 times out of 10 is females for me. And so I do work with a lot of mums, and the first things that we talk about when it comes to foods to stay away from and GMOs come into the subject matter is that the power is in the dollar. You vote with your dollar. And rather than getting upset and bogged down in and overwhelmed in the research and everything, let's educate ourselves, as you've just quite rightly said, in a way that's very empowering. Vote with our dollar. Let's go out and support the local farmers markets. Let's get more educated about where our food comes from, who's handling it, how it's being produced, the ethics of the farmer themselves, the nature of the environment and the animals. And let's start working back with Mother Nature. And it doesn't have to be hard, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And I think that's a really important message that you're sharing there, is that tipping point comes from voting with our dollar and the power of choice when we choose to go to a supermarket or choose to go to the local farmers.
Now, there's a wonderful piece that I want to share, because I'm thinking about anxiety and depression. I'm thinking about what I do, and there's one other area. For me, as an activist trying to change the world, and actually we're doing a very good job of it, it's a numbers game. And it doesn't matter which particular person changes their diet, just at a certain number. They can be concentrated in one geographic region. So we go to the most receptive demographics, the moms, the pet owners, because they're kind of mom, those suffering from chronic conditions, the healthcare professionals, certain religious groups that think GMO really means God move over. So we pick our battles where we will win. But if you have learned this information and you want to convince your son that he needs to change the diet of your grandchild, then you're very attached to that change. And people ask me all the time, how do I change the diet of my relative, uncle, friend, whatever? And I often say, you don't, because you're discounted. Allow me to do it for you. Show them the movie Genetic Roulette. It's the most powerful, most effective conversion tool. So at geneticroulettemovie.com, people can watch it. And I'll give you an example. This same thing happened. There was a woman who was volunteering at a booth where I was working at a conference, and she said to me, I saw your movie, completely changed my life, changed my diet. And then I told my son, if there's anything to talk about guilt, if there's anything that you do in your life because I ask you to, it's to watch this film. So he watched the film, and she said, I want you to change my grandson's diet. So the grandson was out of control. They were constantly calling home from school because he was constantly getting into trouble, and he had trouble breathing. So the son watched the film, changed the diet of the son, and the problems went away. Never gets calls from school except in the days after he eats at the other grandparents' house, because they're not on board yet. And this is not just a one-off. I was speaking at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a scientist about the dangers of glyphosate last year, And a woman stood up and said, I saw my son was out of control and violent, and they wanted to kick him out of school. They wanted to call him retarded. And I saw your film, changed his diet, and all the problems went away. Now he's doing great. I said, how long did it take? She said, 1 week. And then she said, within a month, I had a new son. So again, a certain percentage of people will have these dramatic recoveries. Not everyone, but a certain percentage. So, and we do know that genetic roulette so far has been the best vehicle for conversion. And because there may be, I don't have to worry about who changes, but people hearing this may want to change their husband's or their wife's diet or their son's diet or their parents' diet. So because you're so close, if you can't use your guilt provocation, if you can't use your ability to convince, then use me. And when I first showed the film, when I first previewed it in Los Angeles,
Just lost you there, Jeffrey. Okay, I've got you back.
Okay, she said, as testament to your film, here's my 16-year-old daughter. She wanted to sit in the car during the showing, and now she's telling me we have to get rid of GMOs. And then a woman came up and said, as testament to your film, this is my husband. I've been trying for years to get him to change his diet. Now he's ready to change the diet. So I say this because I don't want this information to create any anxiety or depression, because we're talking about getting rid of anxiety and depression.
That's it. You want power.
And then the last thing is this. I am so aware of the choices I make emotionally because I deal with this stuff all the time. And I'm telling people really, horrible things about, about all these side effects. But I am extremely confident that we are actually winning this and that we are taking power back. And, there's so many ways you can look at society right now. I don't know how much it is like this in Australia, but in the US, there's basic corporate takeover of every area. It's the pharmaceuticals that control medicine. It's the energy companies that control the energy. It's big ag that controls the food. And people can feel very disempowered. In this case, we are totally kicking butt. We are totally on top of things. 40% of Americans say they're avoiding or reducing GMOs, up from 15% in 2007. Now, even if they're not doing what they're saying, the percentage that are saying it is so huge. Over 3/4 of Americans are concerned about GMOs. That's just in the last few years. That's just by educating people. And so we can make a huge difference here, a huge difference.
Well, Jeffrey, what I also know is that, our team have been talking to your team, and we're actually making available to our viewers the Genetic Roulette, your documentary. So it is going to be available there for our viewers to actually use and educate themselves. Which is an amazing offering from you. I've watched it myself. I have a copy of it myself. I highly, highly recommend it to all of our viewers to use as an education tool. Absolutely, hands down. And you've also, what you just said then was, you said that you used the words I am very aware of the emotional choices you make. One of my very last questions to you is actually to offer up to us an I am statement. We're actually putting together an ebook to inspire our viewers on Healthy Me Summit's positive affirmations that start with I am. Wow. So if you're able to just conclude our wonderful chat with one of your I am statements, that would be amazing. We'll add it to the ebook.
I'll just start and see what comes out. I am overjoyed. I am so excited about the direction that life is taking on this planet and what I and others are doing about it. Isn't it fantastic?
It is fantastic, and being here with you today has also been fantastic. I've been incredibly grateful for the time that I've spent just, again, re-educating myself on this very important area and topic that really does affect our mental health and wellness and the wellness of the entire body. So, Jeffrey, again, thank you so much for your time spending with us today. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and safe eating.
Thank you, and you.